Mahatma Gandhi said, "A nation's culture resides in the hearts and in the soul of its people." Pacific Storytelling shares New Zealand with us.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Paper, Ink, and Passports Travel. Um, we're shifting a little bit today from the adventure conversation to a more cultural conversation because in speaking with a very good friend of mine a couple of weeks ago, I learned that he is taking on a new role adjacent to his current role in the tourism space, but talking about storytelling and cultural education specifically for New Zealand. So I'm very, very, very thrilled to introduce my friend Ren West. We met, 3 years ago when he was with Tourism New Zealand, met at Virtuoso Travel Week, and have just stayed in touch, and we've come across each other at other conferences. And he's now with a South Pacific inbound tour operator called Travel 2, but has recently started this storytelling, I want to say, training program. And Ren, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it is specifically geared towards travel advisors who can introduce the Pacific stories to their clients as an educational resource. And I'm going to pass it over to Ren to introduce himself and tell you a little bit more about himself, but he has a very long family history in the New Zealand tourism space, which really lends him perfectly for this role in educating the rest of us about the Pacific stories. So Ren, thank you for coming and chatting with me today. I'm so excited to learn more about this and to talk with you
Yeah.
about the Maori legends and history.
Yeah, kia ora. Thank you, Sarah. It's so fun to be here. And we're having a really global conversation about culture and race relations and all of that kind of stuff. So it's really topical. And you know, I work in the travel industry, as you mentioned, but we're on pause a little bit, and we're having to, rethink some things. And so during this time of lockdown and quarantine and all the rest of it, I've been working on a project that's been really close to my heart for a number of years. Uh, Professionally, I've been working in the travel and tourism industry for over 10 years. And one part of the discussion that just kind of never got talked about enough, in my opinion, was about the cultural tourism and respecting other cultures. Um, and I wanted to start talking about that. So yeah, that's basically what Pacific storytelling is about. It is aimed at the travel agent and advisor community, but this is also a tool that you can put in your hands. You can also walk your clients through as well. Um, One thing that I want to get out to the audience today is that, we all want to be respectful and we all want to learn about other cultures, but sometimes it's really scary. And you never want to make a mistake, but guess what? We're all going to make mistakes. It's just about educating ourselves a little bit first so that we can move forward with a little bit more confidence when we're traveling, and that we're a responsible traveler as well.
And is that what you envision this tool being for us?
Exactly. So it's an online tool. It's just up on my website, pacificstorytelling.com. And they're just 10, 15-minute recordings, and they focus on the South Pacific specifically. And they're told from my perspective as an indigenous New Zealander. But also I look at the experience of other Pacific cultures as well, and how we're similar and how we're different. We talk about Polynesia, Micronesia, Melanesia. These are all different terms within the Pacific, and they all have slightly different ways of looking at the world. So they're recorded. They're very bite-sized, training, so that they don't take up too much of your time. And it's just, there's no quiz at the end of it or anything like that. It's just there for your information, for all people who want to just learn a little bit more about another culture.
Yeah, it's really cool. And I'm looking at the website right now, connecting travelers to the people and culture of the Pacific. And you just mentioned a whole lot of different regions: Polynesia, Micronesia, Melanesia. Um, for our viewers who are going to probably be clients and friends of mine and probably other advisors as well, can you kind of break that down? I mean, what countries fit into each region that we're talking about? Can you give us a 30-second concise history of Polynesia and the diaspora of the Polynesian people, or is that too much to ask?
Sure. Well, look, I'll try. And the thing is that the main thing to remember is that the Pacific Ocean is this huge thing. It takes up a third of the world's surface. It is so vast. And, you know, yes, we can say Polynesia, Melanesia, Micronesia, but quite often we can kind of map it out and put a line on a map. But then you have examples within those different countries where you might have a population who, say, in Fiji, which is technically Micronesian, you might have a population of Polynesians within that island as well. So it gets all very, very complex and complicated. So that's, I guess, what the intention of the trainings is about, is to talk about those areas in a little bit more depth, I guess. Does that answer the question?
I think so. I guess I'm wondering more like, where does Fiji fit in? Where does Tahiti fit in? Where does New Zealand fit in? I mean, all of those countries, you know, are Polynesian, correct? Am I on the right track?
Right. So they're all part of the Pacific, but there are differences. So, for example, a lot of the Polynesian countries, and so that's places like Hawaii, Tahiti, Cook Islands, New Zealand, the indigenous people actually share a very, very similar language. And so different terms. And so the main one that you would be most familiar with is moana. Moana is a term used throughout Polynesia to describe the ocean. And so what that tells us is that we're all related in a very long history of migration through the Pacific. So just to sort of put that into a little bit of context, the Maori migration story, because that was probably the last great migration in the Pacific, that started in Aitutaki in the Cook Islands. So, and then from Tahiti, so they traveled down through Tahiti, through the Cook Islands, all the way to New Zealand, taking with them customs, knowledge, you know, tattooing, weaving, canoe building, all of this stuff. And then they made it their own in their individual unique islands. So New Zealand is an example. They didn't have access to coconut trees, which is what they would make their beautiful fiber and cloth from in the islands. But what do they use in New Zealand instead? They use the flax plant. It looks a little bit different on the face of things, but if you scratch a little bit deeper underneath the surface, you'll see that there's similarities there as well.
Okay. So you mentioned the Maori migration, and again, a lot of our viewers probably aren't super familiar with the stories, which Te Papa in Wellington does a fantastic job of sharing the history of New Zealand, both pre-settler, you know, any settler, pre-human, which was not all that long ago in the comparison to the rest of the world. And it talks then a lot about the Maori migration and the settling of New Zealand by the Maori iwi or tribes. But why don't you share a little bit about that with our viewers?
Sure. So let's talk about it from a geological perspective. New Zealand as a landmass was one of the last things to come up out of the ocean. And so geologically, it's a very young country. And therefore, culturally, it's a very young country as well, because it was only discoverable once it was existing. So the Maori people, and many of the cultures of the Pacific, we talk about an ancestral homeland. And in Maori, we call that Hawaii, not Hawaii, but Hawaii. And this Hawaii, you wouldn't, if you look it up on a map, you won't find that. It's it could be a combination of different places. All it is really is just a way of saying we know we come from somewhere else. So the original story of New Zealand's discovery actually is of a very famous chief named Kupe, and Kupe left his home in the Polynesia somewhere and traveled down to try and find this new land. They knew there was land down there because they were following the patterns of the birds. They were looking at the currents in the ocean. They were watching what the fish were doing. And they were even looking at the clouds because the clouds will develop differently over land versus water. So if you look at the different clouds, you can see, hey, there's land down there. So Kupe was an expert navigator. And one of the common myths is that Maori just happened to find their way down there by a happy accident. Well, no, these people lived on the ocean just as much as they lived on the land. They knew how to interpret the signs of nature. And so Kupe went searching, and all of a sudden in the distance, he saw a long white cloud. And this long white cloud was above land. And his wife called out, he ao, he ao te aroa. A cloud, a long white cloud. And that is coincidentally the Maori name for New Zealand. And you'll hear me maybe interchange that phrase, Aotearoa, New Zealand, as well. So that happened around the year 1350. So fairly recently, that's modern history for a lot of people. You think about that, there were castles with moats around them in Europe at that time, and New Zealand is just being discovered. So, and then, a couple of hundred years ago, you had the arrival of the European. The English name New Zealand actually comes from a Dutchman named Abel Tasman, who came from the province Zeeland in Holland, calling this newfound land New Zealand or New Zealand. So that's how the name New Zealand came to be about. And then it wasn't until Captain Cook set foot in New Zealand that it was claimed as a part of the British Empire.
And that would have been around 1850s, 18.
I haven't got it at the top of my head.
It's okay. I mean, there's statues of him in Gisborne. Actually, that's not Captain Cook. That's some other random British.
No, Captain Cook is there because Poverty Bay in Gisborne is where he first sighted the country. And
named a lot of the less beautiful places, Poverty Bay, Doubtful Sound. Didn't those?
Right.
A little strange.
It is a little bit strange, and there's a little bit of local pushback on those terms now. I think he called it Poverty Bay around Gisborne because they couldn't find any provisions for the ship. There wasn't widespread farming or harvesting available to them there, so he called it Poverty Bay. And I think they should push back against that label today myself, because it's a very plentiful area. Some of my favorite wines actually come from the Gisborne appellation.
Is there a Maori name for Poverty Bay?
Yes, there is. You're asking me all these questions. I need to brush up on these.
Yeah, I only bring it up because one of the things that I discovered being in New Zealand for so long is that, and I don't want to sound ignorant, but correct me, when I'm done saying this. The Kiwis have done a very wonderful job, in my opinion, coming from the US, of keeping the Maori stories and legends and language alive, more so than the Americans did with the native Indian tribes, and then the Australians did with the Aboriginals. And so going through New Zealand, there's a Maori name for almost everything, and half, probably even more than half the towns are Maori words. Everything has, Mount Cook is Aoraki. Um, you have Aotearoa. Um,
Right.
you have all
Gis-
these
Sorry, and it just
names.
came into my head. So Gisborne area, the East Coast is known as Tairāwhiti. So that's a bit of a mouthful, and it took me a little while to get my brain working. But there you go, Tairāwhiti. Names are important because names remember history and commemorate stories of a people. And so, for example, sometimes you'll see really, really long names. So the village where I come from is 36 characters in length, the name, and it is only the third longest place name in New Zealand. And it goes a little something like this. Te whakarewatanga o te ope taua a wahiao.
I'm not even going to try to repeat that.
That's a long one. And that just means that talks about the story of a great war party trying to invade my people's village. So, you know, that's how we didn't have a written history, we didn't have um, museums or libraries or things like that. We had stories and place names, and that's how we handed down our history through the generations, is by naming places after significant events.
Yeah.
So that's why the place names in New Zealand are so important to the local people, and why they are so prevalent as well.
Yeah. And that oral history is something that I think those of us, I mean, those of us with European heritage, like myself, I'm Irish and German, it's something we've heard about, but it's not within any generation. My grandparents wouldn't remember an oral history. My grandparents have always had books. Their parents would have, known how to write and read. And that oral history that you hear about really in the European world is like the Welsh bards and the Irish bards and those stories. But oral history, I can go and I can find a book and I can read all about my history. And I think that passing down of the stories um, from the tribes in New Zealand, but from the elders to the young people is something that is really, it's something that we can't lose because it's part of your story and New Zealand's story as a whole.
Absolutely. And you know what helps us tell the story is tourism. Tourism is something that enables us to share that story widely and for us to relive it every day. So my background is working for a place known as the New Zealand Maori Arts and Crafts Institute, or Te Puia, in Rotorua. Now, Rotorua, that's the centre of cultural tourism essentially in New Zealand. And that particular centre has traditional weaving school, traditional carving school, you know, the arts and the heritage of our people protected actually by law under an act of parliament. So people come to learn about the culture, and therefore we can employ local people who can then share their stories. And they can share the stories about the weaving and the carving, and then go and talk about how they live their everyday life and what their ancestors did and how that's different from what they do now and all of that sort of thing. So tourism has actually played a really big part in helping us to talk about things like that as well.
Yeah.
So that's what one of the benefits of travel and tourism is to be able to share that. And so my family have actually been some of the original storytellers and the founders of tourism in New Zealand. So 5 generations of my family have been guides um, at Te Whakarewarewa Valley as well. So it's something that we take really seriously. It's something that we take a lot of pride in, that legacy, and it's something that you hand down through the generations as well.
Yeah. And I think with New Zealand especially, I mean, when I'm putting an itinerary together for clients, I try to make it as all encompassing as possible. And of course, it's all customized to the client. So if a client has no interest in history, it's a little bit harder to incorporate that. But I always do a balance of, a full day with tours and a leisure day. So I'm always recommending things as well. And especially in New Zealand, with the travelers going to Rotorua, you have some wonderful, again, cultural,
Uh-huh.
I don't want to say attractions, but cultural
Experiences.
Yes, thank you. In that area, of course, it's the geothermal highway
Uh-huh.
as well. In Wellington to Papa, and again, a guide there is fantastic, but it's also, you can easily spend several hours in Te Papa just learning the story of New Zealand. So I think the culture and incorporating that into everything that New Zealand is and what people think of New Zealand. I mean, Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit and
Right.
wine and Milford Sound is one of the natural wonders of the world. So you have all these amazing things in New Zealand, and I think the culture of New Zealand especially really permeates through all of that. Even on the tours in Milford Sound, you're going to hear the white people's story, but you're going to hear the Maori story as well, and you're going to hear the name of it. And it goes back to my comment of how I think you've integrated very well. All the Kiwis I knew down in New Zealand know the Maori founding and the legend. They're taught that in school, which is
we're pretty lucky. It's a very special part of our national identity. Maori is a language is one of the official languages of the country. So you have to have documents and media and schooling and all of that available in Maori. And I think it's what makes us unique. In bringing it back to how it permeates the whole country is right, because a lot of people, when they think about New Zealand, they think about these beautiful landscapes and the wine tasting and all of this sort of stuff. But what leaves the most lasting impression is the people. And the people are incredibly special, and they're very, very proud of their beautiful place, and they're just happy to share it. And so that's, when we're talking about cultural tourism, yes, there are cultural experiences that you go and see traditional artwork and go and see, how a culture has existed for, hundreds of years. However, as you say, you go out on Milford Sound, or one of my favorite examples is actually an adventure activity, which is on the Kaituna River outside of Rotorua, which is hosted by a Maori company called Kaitiaki. And Kaitiaki means guardian. And you've got these beautiful local guides who are taking you whitewater rafting. You're going down the tallest commercially graded waterfalls in the world. And that's a scary thing in itself. But you know what? It's actually a very beautiful experience as well, because the guides, they're a little part of and they'll tell you about the local people, and they'll tell you about what happened here and what happened there, and they will incorporate those local stories. They'll start the tour by acknowledging the local people, even saying a little prayer as well. And so that's technically an adventure activity, but it's also a cultural activity as well. And that's not just one isolated example. You'll see that when you're going through the country, is that you'll find those interactions as you go along.
That's beautiful. That would be something really unique, I think, to be on this whitewater raft and be hearing the stories from the local people. And I think I mentioned it earlier, but Maori is the people, it's the language, but within Maori,
Mm-hmm.
there are tribes, much like we have Native
Right.
American tribes here, and they all have different names and different,
Mm-hmm.
I'm assuming, and maybe I shouldn't assume, but they have different customs and cultures so that I mean, you
Mm-hmm.
know someone is different. You know they're Maori, but you know
Right.
they're from a different tribe. And can you talk about
Right.
that a little bit?
Sure. Absolutely. So yeah, it is. There's always variations and differences between tribes and how they do things. Um, and dialects even. So within New Zealand, there is one language known as the Māori language, but there are a number of different dialects. So you can't just generalize when it comes to culture. And when I'm talking about culture, I always say that it comes from my perspective, coming from the Te Arawa tribe, which is around the Rotorua region. And the main thing is that people know when you're being genuine and sincere, when you're wanting to engage, and they know if you're going to make a mistake, it's okay, and that we all make mistakes. Even us as local people make mistakes as well. Um, and the reason for the differences in the way that people do things tribally is because we descend from different ancestors. So we are a tribal people, and we collect ourselves in groups of people, and we name ourselves generally after that ancestor. So some of the major tribes are called Ngati Parau, Ngati Awa, Ngai Tahu. These are very big tribes that are actually the name of an ancestor as well. So that's how the groupings sort of generally fall. My tribe is different though. So just to sort of give you an example of the differences, my tribe is named after the canoe that brought us from Hawaii to New Zealand, because there was an incident on the journey where the canoe got sucked into a whirlpool, and they came back up, and and to remember that part of our history, the whole tribe is now named after the canoe instead of the ancestor.
Interesting. Would these
Yeah.
ancestors be female or male, or doesn't
Good
that?
question. Good question. So in Polynesia, generally what you'll find is that it's a patriarchal society. The chieftainship is handed down through the male line. It's hereditary, and you would have what we call rangatira, or the leadership structure. And yeah, definitely it was a male, a paternal society. It still remains that way, but women have a very important role, and some may even say that they pull the strings behind the scenes, and that's where the real work is
I would
done.
say that.
Yeah, exactly. But then again, that's a little bit of a generalization, because in my tribal area, women aren't allowed to speak on the marae, on the ancestral meeting house. They're not allowed to stand up and speak. But in different parts of the country, they are allowed. So again, it just changes depending on where you are.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and you New Zealand is such a small country compared, well, it's really not
Yeah.
that small, but compared to what we think, especially the US,
Mhm.
but you are just like us in that you have all these different regions and all these different people. Would a tribe from the far north have a lot
Oh,
in common with a tribe from the Southland?
um, the main thing to remember is that there are we share the same language, even though there may be a different dialect, and there's just we grieve in the same way, but there's just the protocol and the process uh, from one region to another. I want to even zoom out a little bit more and go back to the previous question about leadership and whether, Maori generally it's a patriarchal society. Generally, the chieftainship handed down through the male line. Um, women not being allowed to speak on the marae or the ancestral meeting ground in my area, but being able to speak at another area. Um, and then compare and contrast that to, say, the Cook Islands, where there were female chiefs and continue to be female chiefs. And the same with Hawaii, and Tahiti, there were very strong female leadership personalities as well. So it does vary. There's no one answer to the question. And that's what I think is the toughest part, but also the easiest part of this conversation, is that uh, it's all very fluid. We all, we understand that things can sometimes appear to just go around in a circle instead of in a linear straight line. And that's part of the fun.
Yeah. Well, you brought up, you zoomed out a bit back to looking at, New Zealand versus the Cook Islands and Tahiti and Fiji. And I think that's great because you are Pacific storytelling. You're not New Zealand storytelling. So you are looking at this region as a whole. And I think that we can kind of, not end here, but, we are looking at the full Pacific Island, or Pacific Ocean, all of the islands there, and so many different stories. And to your point of we're all connected, I think we can say that about every culture is connected to another culture somehow. We're not all connected to each other directly, but indirectly, we're all connected around the world. And some of my other videos with other suppliers and friends of mine have touched on the culture in various places. And one of them I'm going to bring up now is my friend Ashish with Big Five talks about the mummification process between Peru and Egypt and the Romans, and how there's a lot of similarities in there. And I think when you start looking at, and that's going back ancient times, and we're looking at much more modern society, like you said earlier. But we are all connected, and those customs and cultures did find their way from island to island, and sometimes even back, I think.
Absolutely. And that's the beauty of travel is, this construct of a country's border is, it's a relatively new one if you really think about it. People just moved and talked and learned from their neighbors. And that's just been going on since the beginning of time. And that's what I think travel brings back, is that the concept of a border is eliminated, and you're just talking to another human being, and you're understanding how they live their life, and you're understanding why they think a certain way. And that's the power of what it is that travel brings to the world.
Mm-hmm. It's very true. And you and I probably had some incredible travel experiences in both of our long travel careers. I know that in Indonesia, I was there on the eve of one of their festivals, and the hotel that I was staying at was in the lobby putting the palm fronds, turning those into one of those really tall, I don't even know what they're called, but they're beautiful, and they're palm fronds, and they've got flowers, and they're just woven together into these massive creations on a pole, and they're put into the streets and they're paraded through. And we got to watch them doing this, and it was something I've never seen before, something that we don't do here, to have this amazing festival. And this came up with another conversation, is that, you know, the West just doesn't really have festivals like other cultures do. But it was amazing to see. And then to your point about the people, everywhere that I have traveled, I've met the nicest people. I've never met a local anywhere that was, you know, horrible and rude and you know, not helpful. I've just met the nicest people. I would say New Zealand, specifically, that's one of the things that I miss the most every day about not being down there, is that every single person I met was wonderful. They were the nicest people. You know, I ran a little beach bar, and when I left, one of my regulars said, "What are you gonna miss, you know, from being here in the Bay of Islands?" I said, "I'm gonna miss you guys. I'm gonna miss the locals who came in every single day and drank the beer and ate the food and joked and laughed and just, you know, were humans." I mean, I knew them. And I would say that you're right. We do bring these things back home with us, and we remember that, and maybe sometimes it slips our minds, but really humans aren't all that different in the end.
Exactly. Couldn't have put it better. Yeah.
Well, you probably could have, but
No, I totally agree with you. Totally agree with you. And yeah, it takes a lot less energy to be kind and be nice too, I think.
it takes a lot less energy to be nice anywhere in the world, and I think you get a little more, you come home with a little more, because you have
Absolutely.
actions that you don't want to forget.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yep.
and I would say that
Exactly.
even if you've met someone in a destination who might not be born and raised in that culture, you know, they're maybe an immigrant, but they've lived there for 10 or 20 years, they bring their own spin to that culture anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And we move around, and especially now in this society where you can, well, not current today, but, you know, get on a plane and go somewhere. You know, it's easier than ever to have those stories and to bring that culture home with you. And yeah.
Yep. Totally agree. Totally agree.
Yeah. So I think what you're doing is fantastic. I will definitely post the link, probably in the comments of this video once it's been posted. And I can't wait to see more. I'm going to watch all the trainings.
Oh my gosh, that's amazing. Yeah. And that's all we can ask, is that we try to understand one another, you know?
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah. Oh, and I will point out, Tourism New Zealand does a wonderful job of talking about the culture and the story of New Zealand as well. And I think what New Zealand has done, I want to say it was probably only last year with the Tiaki Promise,
Mm-hmm.
you know, for the people and the land and the culture, and asking those of us who go to New Zealand to promise that we're going to, I don't exactly remember how they've worded it, but essentially going to New Zealand, you become a guardian of the place.
Yeah, so the Tiaki promise is about recognizing the environment, and the environment meaning the landscape, but also the people, and that you have a commitment when you come to New Zealand to treat that environment with respect, and to tread lightly, and to just be responsible for your actions, on the planet and on the people around you as well. And I think it's a fantastic initiative that we should see more of globally, is encouraging people just to be mindful of the uniqueness of where they are and to help protect it as well.
Well, I did see a news article earlier this week that several places in Europe are asking travelers to not come in for a day. And I want to think it specifically was Venice. They are probably on the same track as New Zealand, asking people to recognize that Venice is an ancient city and it has a wonderful culture, and don't come for a day, come and stay, spend your money with the locals. And I think, I don't know, but I think just the way conversations have been going lately during COVID, is that we're going to see a lot more of that. We're going to see a lot more slow travel and slow tourism and working with locals and getting to know the locals. And, you know, slow travel doesn't need to be what I did in New Zealand, 14 months in one place, one country, but it can be 5 days in a city as opposed to 5 days in 5 different cities. It can be taking a 2-week trip to Europe and only going 3 places. And I think, especially in the luxury sector, we're going to see a lot more of that. And I hope we see a lot more of that.
I think so too. And it just, you're able to have a much more in-depth conversation about life with the locals and with yourself. Yeah, I look forward to a more thoughtful travel experience moving forward. And I think you're right. Post-COVID, I think we're very, very aware of our influence on the world around us. And we will be making more responsible decisions moving forward, and especially in travel.
Yeah. And I think travel advisors have a responsibility to talk about that with our clients and discuss the implications of slow travel, discuss the implications of barreling through Europe and not stopping, but also talking about the culture of the places and discussing, you know, how we can be more mindful and more thoughtful as we're moving through a destination. And I think what you've got here with Pacific Storytelling is a wonderful way to start that conversation, and maybe we'll even inspire this same sort of thing, you know, with other cultures that have that rich oral history as well, and will educate the rest of us, because that's all we can do, right?
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely.
Great. Well, oh my gosh, thank you so much. We've been talking for 45 minutes.
No, thank you. Thanks for having me.
It's wonderful to actually see your face too.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Tell me about it.
Doesn't it